The morning that Clara Beaumont lost everything, the light came in soft and golden across the ridge, the way it always did in early June, the way she had watched it come for 38 years from that same porch, standing in that same doorway, with that same view of the hills rolling westward into the haze. She was 64 years old. Her hair had gone the color of Winter Creek water, silver white and thick, still pinned the way she had worn it since she was a young woman. Her hands were the hands of someone who had worked land, her whole life knuckled and capable with soil worked so deep into the lines of her palms that no amount of washing ever fully cleared it. She stood straight. She had always stood straight. Her mother had told her that a woman who slouched was a woman who had already decided to give up, and Clara Beaumont had never decided that. Nadine was already on the porch when Clara came out. She was 36, slim in the way of women who consider thinness a form of discipline, dressed for town in fabric that had no business being within 50 miles of a working farm. She had her father's eyes, or at least that was what people said when they wanted to say something kind. What Clara had always thought privately in the chambers of her own mind, where she permitted herself honesty, was that Nadine had her father's eyes and none of his warmth. There were 20 silver dollars on the porch rail. Nadine had arranged them in a row edges, touching each one, catching the morning light with the same cold precision as her expression. "This is more than the law requires," Nadine said. Her voice was pleasant. It was always pleasant. That was the thing about Nadine that had always unsettled Clara, the pleasantness, the way cruelty could wear a reasonable tone and call itself practicality. "Father's estate has obligations. The sale of the property will settle the debts and provide me with the capital to start fresh, somewhere more suitable." Clara looked at the coins. Then she looked at the fields beyond the rail, 200 acres of Ozark Hill country that her husband's grandfather had cleared with an axe and a mule team before the war. The hay was already coming in thick this year. The clover in the lower fields was flowering. She could smell it from the porch. "He left this farm to me," Clara said. "He left it to whoever the will named." Nadine smoothed the front of her dress with one hand, a small gesture of dismissal. "You're welcome to speak with Mr. Fowler in town if you'd like clarification on the legal particulars." He handled the paperwork himself. Clara had already spoken with Mr. Fowler. She had sat across his desk 2 days after her husband's funeral, still wearing black, still holding herself together by sheer force of the habits of a lifetime, and she had listened to him read the document that apparently superseded everything she had believed to be true. The will that left everything to Nadine. The will dated 6 weeks before her husband died. What she had not said to Mr. Fowler and what she would not say now to Nadine on this bright June morning was that she had read her husband's real will, had read it herself sitting at his bedside during the long illness when he had asked her to bring the strongbox from the wardrobe shelf and had shown her the documents inside, had explained them carefully, had held her hand while he did it the way a man explains things he wants to make sure are understood and remembered. Everything to Clara, every acre, the house, the barn, the equipment, the timber, rights on the north slope, all of it. That document was gone. She had opened the strongbox herself 2 days after the funeral before the lawyer came and found papers. She did not recognize a will she had never seen signed in her husband's hand, or something close enough to his hand that no one without cause to doubt it would look twice. She knew what had happened. Nadine knew that she knew. And there was not a thing in the world that Clara could prove. "Take the money," Nadine said. "Mrs. Holliday's boarding house in Carthage takes respectable women. I'm told the work is manageable." Clara picked up the 20 silver dollars. She counted them slowly one by one, making Nadine wait, though she could not have said exactly what satisfaction she took from that small act of delay. Then she put them in the pocket of her apron. She did not say goodbye. She went inside and gathered what she could carry. She did not go to Carthage. There was a place on the western face of Beaumont Ridge that she had known since she was a young bride new to this land and still learning its geography. A limestone overhang at the base of the bluff, a shallow bowl in the rock face where the stone curved inward, and the ceiling was high enough to stand under, where a fire ring could be built without the smoke blinding you, where the creek ran close enough for water, but far enough that the spring floods wouldn't reach. She and her husband had sheltered there once in a hailstorm 20 years ago, pressed against the back wall with the horses tied to a cedar tree and the ice coming down so hard it stripped leaves off the branches. They had laughed then, the two of them cold and wet and laughing, because That is what you do when you are young enough to find disaster temporarily amusing. She was not laughing now. She made camp with the efficiency of someone who has spent decades managing a working farm and understands that sentiment is a luxury best deferred until survival is handled. She laid out her bedroll on the stone floor. She built a fire ring from creek rocks. She had brought a small iron pot, a knife, 2 wool blankets, a week's worth of dried provisions, and the 20 silver dollars. She had also brought her husband's Bible, though she could not have explained why, since she had not opened it in years and did not intend to open it now. Some things you carry not because they are useful, but because setting them down feels too much like letting go. The first night she lay on her back on the stone floor and listened to the creek and did not sleep for a long time. The second night was easier. The third night she slept until dawn. She had spent 40 years solving problems. She was not going to stop because this one was larger than the others. On the fifth day, Joe Webb found her. She heard him before she saw him. The slow, deliberate sound of a man in his 70s who has learned to move carefully, who understands that a body at that age is a thing that requires negotiation rather than force. He came around the cedar thicket above the creek and stood at the edge of the overhang, with his hat in his hands, looking at her camp with an expression that was not surprise. Joe Webb was 73 years old. He was a tall man, not as tall as he had once been, the years having compressed him slightly at the shoulders, but tall enough still with hands that were extraordinarily large. Workers' hands, the hands of a man who had spent 50 years doing physical labor in every form it could take. The first 40 years of his life had not been his own. He did not speak of that period directly. He never had. But it was there in him, the way certain things are there in people who have survived the unsurvivable present, in the quality of his patience, in the way he watched situations rather than reacting to them, in the particular stillness he carried, that was not the stillness of peace, but of a man who has learned that survival often depends on reading the room before you move. He had worked the Beaumont farm for 25 years. He had known Clara's husband since before Clara knew him herself. Nadine had let him go the day of the funeral while Clara was still receiving condolences in the parlor, had handed him an envelope at the back door. There was no money for his final month's wages in it. There was a note that said the estate's obligations precluded compensation for the transitional period. He had kept the note. He showed it to Clara now without comment, setting it on the flat stone beside her fire ring. "She put you out too," Clara said. It was not a question. "Last month's wages gone," Joe said. 30 days' work for nothing. He said it evenly, without heat, the way a man reports a fact he has had time to process. "I've been staying with my nephew in Pierce City, but I had to come see how you were fixed first." "I'm fixed well enough." Joe looked around the camp, assessing it the way he assessed everything quietly and thoroughly. His eyes moved to the bedroll, to the fire ring, to the pipe hanging from its branched tripod. He nodded once, which Clara understood to mean that he found it adequate. "Your husband told me," Joe said, and then stopped as if deciding how to continue. He turned his hat over in his hands. "He told me things toward the end, about the property, about what he had arranged." "He told me too," Clara said, "and someone arranged differently." Joe was quiet for a moment. The creek moved over its rocks. Somewhere up on the ridge a woodpecker was working a dead pine. "There's something I need to show you," he said. "Something he asked me to show you if things went wrong." Clara looked at him for a long moment. In 25 years, she had learned to read Joe Webb's silences the way she read weather, by the quality of the quiet, by what was present in it. This silence held something important, something he had been carrying. "Show me," she said. He led her up the slope. The face of Beaumont Ridge rose 40 feet above the overhang, where Clara had made her camp limestone gone gray and gold, with weather and lichen seamed and cracked by centuries of freeze and thaw. The bluff was not particularly dramatic by Ozark standards. It was not the kind of geological feature that inspired postcards. What it was permanent. It had the solidity of things that have simply outlasted everything that tried to remove them. Joe moved along the base of the bluff, picking his way over the fallen rock, using his hands occasionally when the footing was uncertain. Clara followed, watching his feet and then watching where he was looking. He was looking at the rock face itself, at the cracks and seams in the limestone, the way a man looks for something specific. He stopped and pointed. 15 feet up the slope, where the bluff face was crossed by a diagonal fracture in the stone, There was a shadow that was not a shadow, a darkness in the rock that was the wrong shape for a crack too regular, too deep, a rectangle of absolute black in the weathered limestone. That's where they live, Joe said. Clara squinted up at it. Who lives there? Bees. He said it simply. Wild colony. Been in that rock face since before your husband's grandfather cleared the first acre. His grandfather found them. Showed his son. His son showed your husband. A pause. Your husband showed me must be 15 years ago now. Said one day he'd show you too, but there was always something else to tend to, and then there wasn't time. Clara kept looking at the dark crack in the limestone. He used to go up in September, Joe continued. Careful, always careful. Took a few combs, never too many. Left enough for them to make the winter. That honey was the sweetest thing I ever tasted. The cold of that rock, the limestone, it keeps things different inside. Keeps the honey from running thin in summer, keeps it from granulating in winter. Stays perfect. She had eaten that honey every autumn for 38 years. She had eaten it on bread and tea straight from the comb that her husband would bring back from wherever he went on his September morning walks. She had asked him once where it came from. He had said from the hills. She had accepted that because there had been a quality to the answer, a gentleness in the evasion, that told her it was a secret he was not ready to share. She had not pushed. That was one of the agreements of a long marriage, the understanding that some things keep their own time. And now she was standing at the foot of a limestone bluff, looking up at the answer, and her husband was 3 weeks in the ground, and she was 64 years old with 20 silver dollars and a wool blanket and a fire ring built from creek rocks. He asked you to show me, Clara said. If things went wrong, Joe said, his words. He knew things might go wrong. He knew Nadine. Clara stood there for another minute looking up at the crack in the limestone. The morning light had shifted while they walked, and now it came at a lower angle, and she could see something she hadn't noticed before, a thin line of movement against the rock face barely visible from this distance. Bees coming and going from that opening, following routes so established they had worn them into habit. She started climbing. Joe said nothing. He watched her go. She was 64 years old, and her knees were not what they had been at 40, and the limestone was irregular underfoot in ways that required constant attention, and there were stretches where she had to use both hands to maintain her position on the slope. She did not hurry. She did not slow down either. She picked her route, and she followed it with the methodical stubbornness that had characterized everything she had done since the age of 19, when she had arrived in this county with nothing but a trunk of clothes and the particular Ozark girl's conviction that you could solve anything if you were willing to work at it long enough. The crack was larger up close. She pressed herself against the rock and looked at it directly. It was not a crack at all, not precisely. It was an opening, a seam in the limestone where two faces of rock had shifted apart by some ancient geological argument, leaving a gap roughly a foot wide and 3 feet tall, narrow at top and bottom, widest at the middle. The bees moved through it in a steady and purposeful stream, workers returning heavy from the clover fields below, others departing on outbound routes that took them up and over the ridge toward wherever the good forage was this time of year. Clara held herself very still. The bees ignored her. They had no reason to do otherwise. She was simply another part of the landscape, a large, warm object on the rock face, not threatening, not interesting, just there. She waited until she understood the rhythm of the traffic through the opening. Then she pressed her face close enough to feel the air moving outward from the bomb and breathed in. The smell that came from inside the rock was unlike anything she could have described precisely. It was cool air over limestone, the mineral clean of deep rock, and under that the thick, warm scent of wax and honey, and 10,000 working insects, sweet in a way that was not cloying but ancient, the sweetness of something that has been tended carefully over many years by people who understood that taking too much was the same as taking everything. 38 years she had been on this land, and she had not known this was here. She thought about her husband walking up this slope every September morning, alone with his small tin pail in his steady hands, and the thought landed somewhere deep in her chest in a way that was not grief exactly, but was adjacent to it, a recognition of love, expressed in the particular language of a man who showed affection through acts of careful tending. She climbed back down. Joe was sitting on a flat rock at the base of the slope, waiting with the patience that was his characteristic quality, the patience of a man who has learned not to spend energy on things he cannot control. "How deep does it go?" Claire asked. "Don't know precisely. Never went in myself. Your husband said there was a chamber behind the opening, enough room to stand, large enough for additional hives. Joe looked at her steadily. Could be. Clara sat down on the rock beside him. Below them, through the cedar trees, she could see the roof of the farmhouse where she had lived for 38 years. Smoke from the kitchen chimney, which meant Nadine was in residence and presumably planning whatever came next in her efficient dismantling of everything that the Beaumont family had built. A man from St. Louis had come twice already, even before the funeral was properly finished. Clara had seen him walking the property with Nadine, the two of them moving along the base of the bluff, pointing at the limestone, speaking in the shorthand of people who have already agreed in principle and are working out the particulars. She had heard enough standing at the edge of the upper pasture where they hadn't noticed her to understand that the limestone in the ridge was the point. Not the farmland, not the timber, not the water rights. The stone itself. There was money in it for gravel, for road building, for the expanding appetite of cities that needed foundations. She understood what happened to a limestone bluff when a man with money decided there was value in its rock. The bees in that crack in the stone would not survive the first blast. Neither would everything her husband had quietly tended for 38 years of September mornings. Neither would the only evidence she had left of a man who had believed in leaving things better than he found them. I don't know the first thing about bees, Clara said. No, Joe agreed. I don't have equipment, I don't have hives, I have 20 silver dollars and a bedroll. True. I've never harvested honey in my life. I've never caught a swarm. I barely understand how a colony works. She paused. And I'm 64 years old. Joe was quiet for a moment. The woodpecker was still working the dead pine up on the ridge. Your husband started learning that colony when he was 47, Joe said finally. Took him 2 years before he trusted himself to take the first comb. He told me once he'd never learned anything that required more patience. He had more patience than I do. Maybe. Joe turned his hat over in his hands. But you have something he didn't have. What's that reason? Clara looked at the farmhouse roof again, the smoke from the chimney, the distant shape of Nadine's world proceeding on its planned course, unaware or unconcerned that anything in the landscape might resist it. She thought about the honey she had eaten every autumn for 38 years, always assuming it came from somewhere indefinite from the hills, from somewhere her husband went on his quiet mornings. She thought about a man who spent 40 years tending a thing he loved, without ever feeling the need to explain it or show it off, who asked only at the very end, when he knew he would not be there to protect it himself, that someone who knew the land would show his wife where the sweetness was kept. He had known. He had known that things might go wrong. He had known Nadine had known what she was capable of, and he had done what he could to leave Clara a fighting chance in the form of 10,000 insects living in a crack in a limestone bluff. It was the most practical act of love she had ever witnessed. She stood up. I need to know everything you know, she said, about the colony, about how he worked them, about what's inside that opening. Joe stood too unhurried. That'll take some time to explain. Then start explaining. And you'll need tools, wood for hives, jars eventually. I have 20 silver dollars. It's enough to start. She turned and looked back up the bluff. 15 feet above them, invisible now at this angle, the bees moved in and out of the rock on their ancient routes, indifferent to the human negotiations happening at the base of their home. They had survived on that limestone face since before anyone living could remember. They had survived drought and flood and hard winters and the particular chaos that comes when the land changes hands. They had survived because someone had always been careful with them. Clara Beaumont was 64 years old and alone in the world, in ways she had not been since before she married, and she had nothing in her immediate possession except 20 silver dollars, a wool blanket, and a cast iron pot. But she had the ridge, and the ridge had the bees, and the bees had been waiting in that crack in the limestone for 38 years, surviving on the quiet tending of a man who was gone, and on the cool constancy of the rock around them, and on something that might have been patience if bees were capable of it, or might have simply been the biological certainty of an organism that has found its ideal place and sees no reason to leave. She pressed one hand flat against the limestone face of the ridge, feeling the cold of it, the solidity of stone that had been here since before any family had ever claimed any acre of this land. She pulled a small notebook from her apron pocket, The same notebook she used for keeping farm records, for tallying feed costs and yield estimates and the thousand small accountings of agricultural life. She opened it to a clean page. At the top, she wrote, "What I know, what I need to learn, what I need to buy." And then she sat back down on the flat rock beside Joe Webb and began to write. The clover below the ridge was in full flower. The bees were working it in shifts that had probably not changed in 100 years. The smoke from the farmhouse chimney drifted west in the morning air, and somewhere inside that house, Nadine Beaumont was planning the future of a property she had acquired through means that Clara could not prove were fraudulent on a timeline she believed was entirely under her control. She had not yet considered the possibility that a 64-year-old woman with 20 silver dollars and a notebook might have a different opinion about that timeline. She would. The notebook's first page filled quickly. Clara's handwriting was small and precise, the handwriting of someone who had grown up in a household where paper was expensive and words should count. She wrote without stopping, asking Joe questions when she needed to, letting him talk when he had something to offer, absorbing everything with the concentrated attention of a woman who understands that what she is learning right now may be the most important curriculum of her life. The morning moved on. The light shifted across the ridge. The bees came and went. At some point, Joe stopped talking and simply watched her write, and there was something in his expression that was not quite pride and not quite grief, but held elements of both the look of a man who is watching someone step into a story that has been waiting for her. He had made a promise to a dying man. He was keeping it. And Clara Beaumont, 64 years old, sitting on a flat rock at the base of a limestone bluff, with a notebook on her knee and 20 silver dollars in her apron pocket, was doing what she had done every time in her life that the ground had shifted beneath her. She was making a list. She was making a plan. She was not going anywhere. The entrance to the chamber was not built for a woman of 64. Clara discovered this on her third attempt when she finally stopped trying to go through it the way she had gone through every narrow passage in her life, directly and with force, and instead turned sideways, pressed her back against the right face of the opening, and slid herself in with the slow deliberateness of someone who has accepted that dignity is occasionally negotiable when the objective is worth it. She carried a candle in a tin holder. She carried Joe's description of what she would find. Neither prepared her fully for the reality of the chamber. It was 10 feet wide and 8 feet deep, with a ceiling high enough that she could stand without stooping. The walls were natural limestone, smoothed in places by water that had moved through them in some geologic past too distant to imagine, rough and crystalline in others, where the rock had never been touched by anything except air. The floor was uneven but manageable, a landscape of small rises and depressions worn into the stone over millennia. The temperature was extraordinary. Outside in the June heat of the Ozark Hills, the air sat heavy and close and smelled of grass and dust. Inside the chamber, the air was 54 degrees and absolutely still, the kind of stillness that has weight to it, that presses against your ears with a silence so complete it becomes its own sound. The bees had built against the back wall. The comb structure descended from the ceiling in a curtain of wax that was in places nearly as tall as Clara herself. It was old comb, decades old in its deeper sections, darker than the newer construction at its edges, bearing the layered colors of a thing that has been added to carefully over many years by organisms that do not distinguish between past and future, but simply continue. The colony occupied perhaps a third of the available space. The rest of the chamber was bare stone. Clara stood very still and looked at it for a long time. The bees moved around her without concern. She was not a threat. She was not food. She was not interesting. She was simply a large, warm shape in their space, and they had no category for danger, that stood quietly in the dark and did nothing. She had read what she could find. Joe had told her everything he knew, which was considerable for a man who had never kept bees himself, but had spent 15 years watching someone who did. She had spent her silver dollars carefully bringing back 2 books from the lending library in Carthage, returning them before they were overdue, and copying the relevant sections into her notebook in her small, precise hand. She understood, at least in theory, how a colony functioned. The queen, the workers, the drones. The communication systems. She still found slightly difficult to believe the idea that insects could convey information through movement, through the specific language of a dancing body. She understood swarming, the mechanism by which an overcrowded colony reproduces itself by sending half its population out to find a new home. She understood that a swarm was not aggressive, that it was a colony in transition, carrying nothing to defend, looking for shelter, with the urgent practicality of creatures who know that exposure means death. She understood all of this in the way that reading understands things. What she did not yet understand was the texture of it. The reality of standing among 10,000 moving insects and learning to read what was happening around her, not through words on a page, but through the quality of their sound, the particular pitch of the hum when they were calm versus agitated, the smell that rose from the comb when the colony was content versus when something had disturbed them. That knowledge could not come from books. It could only come from time. She began spending her mornings in the chamber, not working, not taking, simply being present, sitting on the flat stone she had dragged in from the slope outside, watching the colony go about the 10,000 tasks that constituted its daily existence. She watched the workers fan their wings at the entrance to regulate the temperature, a living ventilation system so precisely calibrated that the air in the chamber stayed within 2 degrees of 54, regardless of what the Ozark summer was doing outside. She watched the comb builders' workers, half submerged in cells they were extending, with the patient geometry of creatures for whom architecture is instinct. She watched the foragers return heavy and purposeful, and felt the chamber change slightly as they came in, a small increase in warmth, a shift in the sweetness of the air. She was stung 11 times in the first week, twice in the second, once in the third. The stings taught her things the books did not cover. They taught her that moving quickly was an invitation. They taught her that breathing directly onto the comb was an aggravation. They taught her that the smell of fear, which is a real and chemical thing, changed something in the air around the colony in ways that produced an immediate and pointed response. She learned to breathe slowly. She learned to move as if she had nowhere to be and all the time in the world to get there. She learned that patience was not a personality trait in this context, but a technique, a specific physical practice, the deliberate slowing of her own biology to match the rhythms of something that operated on a timescale entirely different from human urgency. Joe came when she needed him and left her alone when she didn't. He had skills she lacked. He was a carpenter of the practical school, not a man for fine furniture or decorative work, but someone who could look at a piece of fallen timber and see what it could become with a handsaw and a plane in time. He built her first log hive from a section of hollow oak he found on the north slope, cleaning out the interior with a spoke shave fitting a rough top bar of split cedar, sealing the exterior with a mixture of pine resin and beeswax that he rendered himself in Clara's iron pot over a low fire. It was not elegant. It was not the manufactured box hives she had seen illustrated in her library books. It was a vessel for a living thing, and it was solid, and it would hold. She placed it in the chamber in early July, positioning it against the left wall, not too close to the wild colony, not so far that the swarming bees wouldn't find it immediately appealing. Then she waited. Bees swarm when their space runs out. The original colony against the back wall was thriving, had been thriving for decades, filling its comb with the systematic efficiency of a community that has long since solved its basic problems and is simply executing solutions that work. At some point in the natural cycle of a successful colony, the queen would lead half the workers out in search of new territory, leaving behind a new queen to continue in the original location. That swarm would need somewhere to go. Clara was providing somewhere. The first swarm came on July 17th, a living cloud of 20,000 bees that emerged from the crack in the ridge with a sound like a rope being cut, a single sharp increase in the hum of the ridge that Clara heard from her camp below and recognized immediately, climbing the slope in her work boots, with her heart doing something she could not quite name, excitement or fear, or the particular alertness of someone who has been waiting for a specific thing and suddenly knows it is happening. The swarm settled briefly on a cedar branch outside the entrance, a mass of bees clustering into the shape of an enormous teardrop, quivering alive, temporarily suspended between the old home and the new. Then, as if a decision had been reached by consensus too quiet for human perception, it moved. Into the gap in the limestone, into the darkness, into the log hive on the left wall. Clara sat at the entrance to the chamber and listened to the sound of it. A new colony taking possession of a space has a particular quality to it, a change in the acoustic character of the air, an increase in purposeful movement, a new thread of sound woven into the existing hum of the wild colony. She had read about this. Reading had not prepared her for the reality of hearing it, for the way it settled into her chest, like something she recognized from a long time ago, the sound of a thing beginning. The second swarm came on August 4th. By the end of summer, she had 4 established colonies in the chamber, plus the original wild colony that had been there since before anyone living could measure. She did not harvest anything that first season. This was the decision that cost her the most in the immediate sense, in the practical currency of provisions and survival. Her 20 silver dollars were nearly gone by August. She ate what she could forage and what she could grow in the small garden she had planted in the clearing above the overhang. She ate less than she was accustomed to eating. She was 64 years old and she was sleeping on a stone floor and reducing her caloric intake, and there were mornings when she climbed the slope to the chamber and sat in the cool dark and thought with a clarity that had nothing sentimental about it that she might simply be wrong, that this was not a plan but a delusion, that she was an old woman who had lost her home and was hiding in a cave and talking herself into believing that insects would save her. She wrote those mornings in the notebook. She wrote them down and looked at them, and then she wrote down the other things the colonies establishing beautifully in the cool dark the comb building at a rate Joe said was faster than anything he'd seen from surface hives, the quality of the honey she had tasted from a single broken cell against the back wall, the purity of it, the impossible complexity of its flavor. She let the bees have their first winter's production entirely, and spring came. April of 1892 arrived with the particular generosity of Ozark Springs, a sudden warmth after a winter that had tested the patience of everything alive in those hills. The clover came early. The wildflowers on the ridge came 2 weeks before anyone expected them. The colonies in the chamber, protected from the temperature swings that plagued surface hives, had wintered so successfully that by April all 4 were crowded with new brood and fresh stores. Clara made her first harvest on April 19th. She worked by lantern light in the chamber, moving with the deliberate slowness she had spent a year practicing her breath, calm, her hands steady. She had fashioned a simple veil from cheesecloth and a wide-brimmed hat. Joe had recommended it. She had spent 6 months convincing herself she didn't need it, and 20 minutes watching a hive inspection go wrong in her mind's eye before accepting the compromise. She took from each of the 4 hives, leaving the wild colony entirely alone. She took only what she assessed as surplus, the capped honey cells in the uppermost sections of the comb, the stores that represented production beyond what the colony would need to sustain its spring expansion. She left margins. She left more margin than she took. 12 pounds from 4 hives. She sat at the entrance to the chamber with the combs in her tin bowl and the lantern burning beside her and looked at what she had. The honey was dark amber, darker than anything sold in any store she had ever entered, the color of very old wood or the creek in autumn when the tannins came in from the fallen leaves. She dipped one finger and tasted it. She had eaten this honey for 38 years and had never tasted it like this, had never paid attention to it. The way you pay attention to something you understand, you are in the presence of something specific and irreplaceable. The flavor moved through stages. First the immediate sweetness, then the complex middle, the wild clover, and the Ozark hillside and something mineral. Underneath the limestone itself perhaps, or the particular microclimate of a cave that had been filtering pollen for decades. Then the finish, clean and long, and unlike anything she could compare it to. She jarred it in 12 mason jars she had bought in town with her final coins. She carried those jars to Carthage. The general store offered her 30 cents a pound. Clara looked at the man behind the counter. She looked at the jars on his shelf behind him. Pale amber commercial honey shipped from Kansas City, sitting in identical unmarked containers with no story attached to them, no origin, no distinction. She looked back at him. She picked up her 12 jars and walked out. The Ozark Grand Hotel sat at the edge of town, a 3-story building that catered to visitors from St. Louis who came to take the mineral waters and escape the summer heat and who were accustomed to paying for quality in ways that people who lived with quality never were. Clara walked around to the kitchen entrance. Mrs. Eleanor Cross was a woman of 50 with a flour-dusted apron and the expression of someone who has been interrupted before and found it rarely worthwhile. She looked at Clara's homespun dress and her 12 jars and her 64-year-old face with the directness of a woman who has no time for either deference or pretense. "I'm not buying whatever you're selling," she said. "Taste this first," Clara said. She set one jar on the kitchen work table and opened it. The smell of the cave honey moved through the kitchen air, immediately warm and complex, changing the quality of the room. Clara watched Eleanor Cross's expression shift, without the woman apparently being aware that it had shifted. She picked up the jar. She found a spoon. She tasted once. A pause. She tasted again. She set the spoon down and looked at Clara with new attention, the kind of attention that has money behind it. "Where does this come from?" Eleanor Cross asked. "From limestone caves in the hills above Beaumont Ridge." A flicker of recognition. "The Beaumont property." "It was," Clara said. "I am Clara Beaumont." Eleanor Cross looked at her for a long moment, and whatever she was calculating in that look, it arrived at a number quickly. $2 a pound. Bring me everything you produce. My guests will pay 4 times that for something like this on their breakfast biscuits, and they'll tell everyone they know where they had it." Clara sold all 12 jars before noon. She walked back to her camp with $24 in her apron pocket, more money than she had held since before the funeral. She sat by her fire that evening and wrote in her notebook for a long time. She did not write about the relief, though it was there. She wrote about the math. Each established colony in a year of full production would yield roughly 20 pounds of harvestable honey. At $2 a pound, each colony was worth $40 annually. 4 colonies meant $160. At the expansion rate the chamber could support, and she had measured that chamber carefully with a rope and noted the measurements in her book, there was room for 24 colonies in the existing space, plus whatever she could carve from the adjacent stone. 24 colonies. At $40 per colony, in a chamber where the constant temperature would make the honey superior to anything any competitor could produce. The number she arrived at was not the number of a woman who had lost. She bought more materials, more log sections from the mill, more jars. She expanded her garden. She bought provisions enough that she was no longer thinking about food as a daily problem to be solved. She bought a proper veil, which Joe considered a reasonable capitulation to reality. She spent the summer of 1892 building. By September, she had 12 colonies in the chamber. By the following spring, she would have 20. The news of cave honey spread from the Ozark Grand Hotel to 3 other establishments in Springfield. A specialty grocer in St. Louis wrote her a letter requesting 20 jars a month year-round at premium pricing. Then winter found the weakness she hadn't seen. January of 1893. During the coldest week the Ozarks had recorded in a decade, Clara noticed something in 2 of her 12 hives. The pattern of activity was wrong, subtly wrong, in the way that only someone who has spent 2 years learning to read a colony's rhythms would notice. The bees in those 2 hives were not moving with the settled purpose of a healthy winter cluster. There was a dispersal to their movement, a lostness. She brought her lantern close and looked at the comb. American fool brood has a smell. It is an unmistakable smell. Sweet and wrong, the sweetness of decay, dressed up in biological processes that have nothing to do with honey and everything to do with a pathogen that does not care about the 2 years of work that went into the colonies it destroys. She had read about it. She had hoped that the isolation of the cave, the cool temperature, the relative protection from the external factors that spread disease through apiaries would protect her. It had not protected 2 of her 12. She sat in the chamber for a long time with her lantern burning and looked at those 2 hives and understood what she had to do. Joe was at the entrance to the cave when she came out, alerted by something in the quality of her footsteps, some change in pace that communicated itself to a man who had been reading people for 73 years. 2 hives, she said. He understood immediately. He had known farmers his entire life, had watched the math of agricultural disaster operate on good people with no interest in fairness. He started to say something and offer to help, a suggestion about procedure. "I'll do it myself," Clara said. She did not want company for this. She did not fully understand why, except that there was something in it that needed to be private, the same instinct that makes people want to grieve alone before they grieve in public. She had built those hives. She had caught those swarms. She had sat in the dark with those colonies through a summer and a fall and learned their particular sounds. She went back into the chamber. She worked by lantern light. She removed the hive bodies frame by frame, careful even now, even in the act of ending them, not to disturb the other 10 hives around her. She carried everything out to the slope above the overhang to the fire Joe had already built without being asked, because 73 years had given him the wisdom to help without requiring instruction. She burned the infected material completely. 2 hives, 40 pounds of honey she would not sell, 6 months of work she would not recover. She stood by the fire until it burned down to coals, and then she went back into the chamber and sat among her 10 remaining colonies and listened to them breathe in the dark 10 living systems that had survived the winter. Intact 10 sources of a product that she was beginning to understand was unlike anything else available within 3 states. She did not weep at the fire. She wept in the chamber briefly and efficiently because she had not given herself any other place to do it, and because the bees genuinely did not care, and that was oddly the most comforting thing about them. Then she opened her notebook and began calculating what she would need to do to be at 20 hives by spring. Spring came. She reached 20 hives by April. The Springfield restaurants were now ordering monthly. Eleanor Cross had started billing the cave honey on the menu by name, Beaumont Ridge Cave Honey, and guests were asking for it, specifically were mentioning it in the letters they wrote home to St. Louis, were requesting that their hostesses serve it when they came to dinner. The St. Louis grocer who had written to her the previous year was now writing monthly, increasing his order, asking if she could guarantee supply. The name was spreading in the way that genuinely distinctive things spread, not through advertising, but through the mechanism of people who have tasted something real, feeling compelled to tell someone about it. It was in this way that Douglas Alderman came to know about Beaumont Ridge Cave Honey before he knew what Beaumont Ridge was. Clara learned this from Eleanor Cross, who mentioned it in the way of a woman sharing a piece of intelligence she thought the other woman might find useful. Alderman had dined at the Ozark Grand 3 weeks ago. He had asked about the cave honey specifically. He had asked where it came from. Eleanor had told him the hills above Beaumont Ridge and Alderman had gone quiet in a way that she found interesting enough to remember and report. He was the same man who had been walking the Beaumont property with Nadine pointing at the limestone bluff pricing the stone. He was buying Clara's honey through restaurants in St. Louis without knowing he was giving money to the woman whose home he intended to destroy. Clara sat with this information for a long time. She did not share it with Joe immediately. She wrote it in the notebook. She looked at it from several angles, the way she looked at a problem on paper, considering its geometry, its implications, the ways it might be useful. Then Ruth mentioned over their next transaction that she had heard from the hotel owner that Alderman and Nadine had progressed in their negotiations. Papers would be signed within the month. The bluff would be sold, surveyed, and preparations for quarrying would begin before the summer was out. Clara closed her notebook. She had 20 hives. She had documented sales receipts going back 18 months. She had a 3-year supply contract with the Ozark Grand Hotel signed and sealed, representing a guaranteed minimum revenue that she had calculated carefully and which exceeded the assessed value of the land itself as farmland. She had $400 in cash saved coin by coin over 18 months of selling honey at $2 a pound while living on as little as a woman who had spent decades running a working farm could manage to live on. She had everything she needed to walk into a bank. The morning she put on her best dress and walked into the offices of the Carthage Savings and Trust, the temperature on the main street was already climbing toward 90. The dress was 4 years old and had not been worn since a funeral that now occupied a different kind of significance in her memory than it had at the time. She wore her hair up, properly pinned, in a way that communicated the kind of order that bankers respond to. Thomas Briggs ran the Carthage Savings and Trust the way certain men of that era ran things, with a combination of genuine competence and reflexive skepticism toward anything that arrived in his office outside the normal channels. He was 67, thin, with the precise and guarded manner of a man who has seen enough desperate people to have developed an immunity to desperation. He listened to Clara's entire presentation without interrupting. She had organized it carefully, the receipts in date order, the supply contracts, the inventory of 20 hives with projected production figures, the cash she could put forward against the balance. She spoke without emotion in the language of numbers and documented evidence because she understood that what she was asking for would be evaluated on those terms. When she finished, Briggs looked at the papers for a long time. Then he looked at her. And he said the thing she had not anticipated, the thing that no book had prepared her for, and no amount of practical problem solving had helped her foresee, because it was not a problem with a solution in the ordinary sense. It was a wall with no door in it. Missouri law, 1891. A widowed woman borrowing against property as a sole applicant required a male cosigner. The law made no exceptions for revenue for collateral for documented business success. It was not a policy. It was not a preference. It was the law as written and as enforced. Clara looked at the papers in front of Briggs. She looked at the numbers she had spent 18 months assembling. $400 in crunch, $1,100 in documented annual revenue, a 3-year guaranteed contract, a product with no meaningful competition in its market. None of it was sufficient because of a single fact about her biology that had nothing to do with any of it. She said nothing for a long moment. Briggs had the decency to look uncomfortable. He was not a cruel man. He was a man operating within a system he had not designed and did not question, which is perhaps worse than cruelty in the aggregate, but is not something that feels like cruelty from inside it. Is there no other arrangement? Claire asked. Her voice was level. A male co-signer, Briggs said. Someone willing to stand as guarantor. A man, she said. That is the legal requirement, yes. She gathered her papers. She straightened them precisely. Each receipt aligned the contracts on top the cash figures in her own handwriting on the last page. She returned them to the folder she had brought them in. She stood. Thank you for your time, she said. She walked out of the bank and stood on the main street of Carthage in her 4-year-old funeral dress, with the sun hammering down and the dust rising from the wagon traffic on the road. Joe was waiting on the bench outside because she had told him to wait, but not why. He looked at her face and read whatever was in it with the accuracy of long acquaintance. The law won't let me borrow without a man to guarantee it, Clara said. Joe was quiet. The wagon traffic moved past. Somewhere down the street, a dog was conducting an extended argument with a post. Then we find a woman, Clara said. Joe looked at her. He waited. Eleanor Cross, she said. She's been buying my honey for 18 months. She knows what it's worth. She knows what I'm worth. Clara turned and looked back at the bank, at the brick facade of it, at the solidity of an institution that had just told her that her $1,100 a year in revenue was legally invisible. I'll offer her 15% of the business for 5 years, for her signature, for her name on the document as a business partner. A pause. Briggs didn't say the co-signer had to be a man. He said the borrower couldn't be a sole female applicant. 2 women applying together is a different document. Joe considered this. He had spent 73 years watching people find the edges of the walls that were built around them, and he had a practiced eye for the difference between a wall with no door and a wall with a door that no one had thought to look for yet. You'll have to move fast, he said. If Nadine signs with Alderman before you have the loan secured, I know. How long does the bank need to process? Briggs said 10 days if the application is complete. And Eleanor Cross needs to agree first. Yes. And Nadine and Alderman could sign any time. Yes. Joe picked up his hat from the bench beside him and put it on his head and stood unhurried in the way of a man who has decided on a course of action and is organizing his body accordingly. You'd better go talk to Eleanor Cross, he said. Clara was already walking. Eleanor Cross was in the middle of preparing a Tuesday luncheon for 14 hotel guests when Clara walked through the kitchen door, and she looked at Clara's face and told her sous chef to handle the soup. They sat at the small table in the corner of the kitchen where Eleanor did her ordering and her accounts, the table stacked with invoices and supply ledgers, and the organized evidence of a woman who ran a serious operation and understood numbers the way serious operators do. The kitchen moved around them, steam and movement, and the controlled chaos of midday service. But Eleanor Cross had the quality of a woman who could hold a private conversation in the middle of a battlefield, who had learned through decades of professional necessity to compartmentalize completely. Clara laid out the proposal in the same direct language she had used with Thomas Briggs an hour earlier, except that this time she did not need to explain the value of what she was selling, because Eleanor had been buying it for 18 months and had watched it transform her breakfast service from a standard hotel offering into something guests mentioned by name in their letters home. She said 15% of the business revenue for 5 years in exchange for Eleanor's signature as co-applicant on a loan of $800 from the Carthage Savings and Trust Funds to be used for the purchase of the Beaumont Ridge property currently under negotiation by Nadine Beaumont and a St. Louis businessman named Douglas Alderman. Eleanor Cross listened to all of it without expression. Then she said, "Show me the numbers." Clara opened her folder on the table between them and walked Eleanor through 18 months of receipts through the supply contract, through the production projections for 50 hives in a fully expanded cave system, through the revenue figures that the St. Louis grocers' letters represented, through the competitive landscape, which was to say, the complete absence of any product remotely comparable to Beaumont Ridge Cave honey within 3 states. Eleanor Cross looked at the numbers for a long time. She was not a woman who made decisions before she had finished thinking, which Clara respected, and she did not try to hurry her. Finally, Eleanor said, "Nadine Beaumont tried to have me stop buying from you." Clara looked at her. 8 months ago, Eleanor said. She came to the hotel, said there was a dispute over the origin of the honey, that the caves were on her property, and therefore the product was hers to sell or withhold as she saw fit. A pause. I told her that until someone showed me a court order, I would continue buying from the woman who brought me the product. She never mentioned a court order, Clara said. No, she went away. Eleanor straightened the receipts on the table, aligning them with the habit of an orderly person. I wondered how long before she found another angle. She found one, Clara said. She's selling the ridge to a quarryman. Eleanor Cross looked at the folder of numbers in front of her. Then she looked at Clara, the long, direct look of a woman taking the full measure of another woman, and Clara held it without flinching, because there was nothing in her situation that she was ashamed of, and nothing she needed to hide. 20%, Eleanor said, for 5 years, and I want the right to sell cave honey directly through the hotel gift shop at my own retail margin. Done, Clara said. Eleanor Cross stood up, retied her apron, and called her sous chef back to the soup. I'll be at the bank at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, she said over her shoulder. Don't be late. Clara walked back through the kitchen door and into the afternoon heat of Carthage's main street and stood for a moment with her eyes closed, not in relief exactly, but in the particular stillness that comes when a piece of machinery you have been building finally engages and begins to move. Joe was still on the bench. Well, he said. 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, Clara said. He nodded once, the single nod that meant he was satisfied. They walked back to the livery where Joe had arranged the wagon, and Clara sat beside him on the bench as he turned the horse toward the ridge, and neither of them said much because there was not much that needed saying. The deal was made. The bank was next. After the bank came the harder thing. Thomas Briggs received them at 9 the following morning with the careful neutrality of a man who has had time overnight to examine his own legal position and arrived at nuance. 2 women co-applying was, as Clara had correctly identified, technically distinct from a single female applicant. It existed in a gray area of the statutes that Briggs had apparently spent some portion of his evening reviewing, because when they sat down he had a specific section of Missouri banking law open on his desk, marked with a slip of paper. It was not comfortable for him, that was visible. But Thomas Briggs was at the core of his character, a man who believed in sound lending, which meant he believed in documented revenue, in viable collateral, in the probability of repayment, and every piece of evidence in Clara's folder pointed clearly in one direction, regardless of what the law had been designed to assume about women's capacity for business. He approved the application. Processing would take 10 days. Clara left the bank with Eleanor Cross and shook her hand on the street in front of it, a brief and businesslike exchange, the handshake of 2 women who have made an agreement and intend to keep it. 10 days, Eleanor said. I know. Do you know where Nadine Beaumont is in her negotiations with aldermen? Not precisely, Clara said, but I intend to find out. She drove the wagon to the land registry office, where a clerk who had not looked up from his ledger when she walked in told her, after some persuasion, that no deed transfer had been recorded for the Beaumont Ridge property. She drove past the lawyer's office, Mr. Fowler, who had handled the will that had taken her home, and saw through his window that Nadine Beaumont was sitting across his desk. She did not stop. She drove back to the ridge and climbed to the chamber and sat among her 20 hives in the cool dark and thought. The 10 days that followed were not comfortable days. They were the days of a woman who has done everything she can do and is waiting on processes that move at their own pace, indifferent to the urgency of anyone's situation. She worked the hives with the focused concentration of someone who needs her hands occupied so her mind doesn't eat itself. She expanded the chamber's second alcove, the extension she had been chipping at for months with a hammer and cold chisel, working the soft limestone in the hours when the bees were less active. She wrote in her notebook every evening long entries that worked through contingencies, that mapped out what she would do if the bank was slow, if Nadine signed before the 10 days were up, if Alderman moved faster than expected. On the 8th day, Eleanor Cross sent a note by the hotel's errand boy. It arrived at the overhang camp in the late afternoon, and Joe brought it up to Clara at the chamber entrance. Clara read it standing on the slope with the evening light coming gold across the ridge. Alderman had been at the hotel for dinner the previous evening. He had ordered the cave honey with his biscuits. He had asked Eleanor Cross, as he apparently asked every time, where precisely the honey came from. Eleanor had told him for the first time with full specificity from limestone caves in the face of Beaumont Ridge, produced by a woman named Clara Beaumont, who had been operating the apiary for 2 years. Eleanor's note said that Alderman had put his fork down, that he had asked several careful questions about the extent of the cave system, that he had left dinner earlier than expected and had not finished his biscuits. Clara folded the note and put it in her apron pocket and stood on the slope for a moment looking out over the Ozark Hills in the evening light. Then she went back into the chamber and continued chipping at the limestone. The loan was approved on the morning of the 10th day. Clara rode to town with Joe in the wagon and signed the papers in Briggs's office, with Eleanor Cross seated beside her, and the bank draft was made out in both their names, $800. And the moment the ink dried on her signature, Clara felt something change in the composition of the air around her. Some weight that had been pressing since the morning of the 20 silver dollars lifting, fractionally not gone, but no longer the only thing. She drove directly from the bank to the Beaumont farm. The driveway looked different to her now, not because it had changed, but because she had changed, because the last time she had traveled, she had been leaving with her belongings in a cloth bag, and now she was arriving in a borrowed wagon with a bank draft in her apron pocket. The elm trees her husband had planted along the drive 30 years ago had put on new growth this spring, as they always did, as they would continue to do regardless of who claimed ownership of the ground their roots were in. Nadine was on the porch. She had seen the wagon coming up the drive, Clara supposed, and had come out because she was that kind of woman, the kind who meets things standing up rather than waiting to be found sitting down. Clara gave her that. Whatever else Nadine Beaumont was, she was not a coward. Clara climbed down from the wagon without hurrying. She walked to the porch steps and stopped. The two women looked at each other across the distance of 3 years and everything that had happened in them. Nadine spoke first. "Whatever you think you're doing, I'm buying this property," Clara said. $800, cash equivalent, in the form of a bank draft from Carthage Savings and Trust issued this morning. Nadine's expression did not change immediately. It changed the way stone cracks in a hard frost, invisibly at first, and then all at once. "Alderman has already agreed to purchase. The papers are with Mr. Fowler." "The papers aren't signed," Clara said. "I checked the registry office this morning before I went to the bank. No transfer has been recorded. No consideration has changed hands." She took the bank draft from her apron pocket and held it between 2 fingers. "I'm matching his offer. You can take mine today, or you can wait for his." "Why would I take yours?" The pleasantness was still in Nadine's voice, but it was working harder now, the way a dam sounds different when the water behind it rises. "His offer is the same amount, and he has no history with this property that complicates the transaction." "He has a problem with this property," Clara said. "That's why I'm here." She had thought about how to do this on the drive over. She had considered the version that revealed everything at once, and the version that revealed only what was necessary and nothing more. And she had chosen the second because she had learned from 38 years of managing a working farm that the minimum effective intervention was always preferable to the maximum dramatic one. "Douglas Alderman has been eating my honey at the Ozark Grand Hotel for the past 3 months," Clara said. "He's been asking about it by name. Yesterday evening, Mrs. Cross told him where it comes from. He now knows that the limestone cave system in Beaumont Ridge, the same formation he intends to quarry for road gravel, is currently occupied by a 20-hive commercial apiary producing the most sought-after specialty honey in 3 states. Nadine said nothing. "He also knows because Mrs. Cross told him that I have been operating this apiary for 2 years, that I have commercial contracts, and that my operation is the source of a product his own restaurants in St. Louis are purchasing at premium prices." Clara kept her voice even. "He is a businessman, a practical man. The same qualities that made him want to buy this property will make him calculate very carefully whether it is more valuable as a limestone quarry or as the exclusive source location of Beaumont Ridge Cave honey." The silence on the porch was complete. Even the elm trees along the drive seemed to have stopped moving. You're bluffing, Nadine said. I've spent 3 years inside that ridge, Clara said. I know the cave system better than any surveyor alderman could hire. I know that the chamber system extends further than the surface formation suggests, and I know that a quarrying operation in the upper bluff would affect the cave structure in ways that would end any honey production permanently. She paused. But Alderman doesn't know that yet. What he knows right now is that there's a producing apiary in the rock he wants to blast apart. That's enough to make him want a survey. That survey will take time. And while he waits for it, my offer is on the table. Clara set the bank draft on the porch rail in the exact place where 3 years ago, Nadine had arranged 20 silver dollars in a careful row. $800, Clara said. Clean, today, no lawyers, no surveys, no delays. Nadine looked at the bank draft. She looked at Clara. She looked at the draft again. Clara waited. She was 64 years old and she had been waiting in one form or another for 3 years, and she was genuinely comfortable with the silence in a way that she suspected Nadine was not. Patience she had learned from 10,000 bees in a limestone cave was not the absence of urgency. It was urgency that had learned to be still. Nadine picked up the bank draft. She read it. She read it again. She looked at Clara with an expression that had finally abandoned the pleasant register entirely and arrived at something more honest, something that was partly calculation and partly a feeling Clara recognized from the mirror as the specific look of a person confronting the fact that they have underestimated someone. I'll need the legal fees for dissolving the existing agreement with Alderman, Nadine said. That's between you and Mr. Fowler, Clara said. My offer is $800 and it doesn't move. Another silence. The elm trees at the edge of the drive caught the afternoon light the way they always had, the way they had for 30 years. A red-tailed hawk moved in a slow circle above the north pasture. The clover in the lower field, visible over the fence line from where Clara stood, was in full June flower white and deep pink against the green, and somewhere above the ridge, the bees were working it in the steady, unhurried shifts of creatures for whom the economics of abundance are simply the structure of every available day. I'll have Mr. Fowler draw the papers, Nadine said. Clara did not permit herself any expression. I'll be in town tomorrow morning. She turned and walked back to the wagon without looking at the house. She had not allowed herself to look at the house, at the windows or the door or the kitchen garden her husband had laid out with a string line 30 years ago. She would look at all of it when it was hers again. There was a difference between looking at something that belonged to you and looking at something that had been taken from you, and she intended to experience only the first kind. Joe said nothing on the drive back. He had heard everything from the wagon seat. He sat with his hands on the reins and his eyes on the road, and his expression was the expression of a man who is satisfied with how something has gone and sees no reason to elaborate on that satisfaction. That night, Clara sat at the entrance of the chamber and listened to the bees. 20 hives in the cool dark, the hum of them layered and complex, not a single sound, but a texture of sounds that she had learned over 2 years to read, the way she read weather or soil or the health of an animal. The colony was calm. The colony was productive. The colony was doing what it had been doing in this limestone face for longer than anyone could fully account for, continuing the work of its own existence with the absolute indifference to human drama that she had come to find genuinely comforting. Her husband had climbed this slope every September for decades alone in the early morning and had taken what the bees could spare and left what they needed and had never mentioned it, never claimed credit for it, never turned it into a story about himself. He had just done it year after year as an act of participation in something that existed before him and would continue after him. She understood that now in a way she hadn't when he was alive, to make it comprehensible. The papers were signed the following morning at Mr. Fowler's office, and Mr. Fowler had the particular expression of a man who had expected this meeting to go differently and was managing his adjustment to reality with professional composure. Nadine signed without ceremony. Clara signed without ceremony. The deed was transferred on the 14th of June, 1893. Clara walked out of Fowler's office into the summer morning with a piece of paper in her hand that said what had always been true and had spent 3 years being untrue, that the Beaumont Ridge property, 200 acres in the Ozark Hills of Missouri, belonged to Clara Beaumont. She did not go to the farm immediately. She went to the ridge first. She climbed the slope as she had climbed it hundreds of times in the past 2 years, past the overhang where she had spent 3 winters on a stone floor, past the flat rock where she and Joe had sat on the morning. He showed her the crack in the limestone, and she climbed to the opening in the rock face, and she squeezed herself in sideways as she always did, and she stood in the chamber with her 20 hives humming around her in the constant 54-degree air. She held the deed against her chest and stood in the dark and let herself feel the whole of what had happened. Not the transaction of it, not the legal transfer and the signatures and the numbers, but the actual meaning of it, the 3 winters on stone, the 200 bee stings, the 12 jars that had become $24, that had become an operation, that a hotel staked its breakfast reputation on the one bad decision that could have broken everything, the disease in the 2 hives that she had burned on a cold January slope the morning she had walked into a bank with $1,100 in documented revenue and been told that the law could not see it. She thought about her husband walking up this same slope every September, this same slope she had walked every morning for 2 years, without knowing he had walked it first, without knowing that his quiet autumn excursions had been this standing in this same dark, with this same cool air and this same sound around him. She thought about the fact that he had known things might go wrong and had arranged what protection he could, had told Joe, had made Joe promise, had left her this. Not money, not legal remedy, not protection from the injustice that came, but something older and stranger, and ultimately more powerful, the knowledge of where the honey was. She stayed in the chamber for a long time. Then she went to the farm. The house had the particular quality of a space that has been lived in by someone who was not its proper inhabitant, a thinness to the air, a smallness, rooms that had contained 38 years of a real life waiting out the interregnum of an interloper. The kitchen was wrong. The parlor was wrong. Her husband's study was so wrong that she stood in the doorway and could not enter it and did not try. But then she saw it. On the kitchen table, pushed to one side as if it had been encountered and found unremarkable and left alone, was a stone crock with a waxed linen cover tied with a piece of twine. Clara crossed the kitchen and lifted the linen and found inside it a quantity of dark amber honey, crystallized now with age, the color of old amber, the specific dark color of Beaumont Ridge Cave honey. It was her husband's last September harvest. He had brought it in from the ridge the autumn before he got sick, had set it on the kitchen table in the crock he always used, as he had done every autumn for 30 years. She had eaten some of it that fall, and then he had gotten sick, and everything had moved into the terrible, compressed time of a serious illness. And she had not thought about the crock again, and apparently Nadine had not touched it, had found it unremarkable, had left it sitting on the table for 3 years. It had been waiting. Clara set the deed on the table beside the crock. She found a spoon in the drawer where it had always been. She opened the crock and worked the crystallized surface and tasted what was inside the flavor she had eaten every autumn for 38 years, which she had spent the past 2 years learning to understand completely. It was still perfect. Crystallized honey does not spoil. It simply changes state, becomes denser, more concentrated, the flavors compressed and intensified. She stood in the kitchen of the house she had lived in for 38 years and ate her dead husband's last harvest and did not try to stop whatever was moving through her chest, because she had learned in 2 years of sleeping on a stone floor that there was a time for being efficient and a time for allowing the full weight of something to land, and she was done being efficient for the moment. Joe arrived in the afternoon. He found her in the kitchen garden, which had not been tended in 3 years, and had reverted to a productive chaos of self-seated volunteers and ambitious weeds, and he looked at it with the eye of a man making an inventory. "The herb beds are salvageable," he said. "I know," Clara said. "The kitchen garden beds will need turning before fall." "I know. The barn roof has 3 bad sections." "Joe," Clara said. He stopped. "Thank you," she said. He turned his hat over in his hands, the gesture she had seen 100 times. "Your husband asked me to look after things," he said. "I did what I said I'd do." "You did more than that." He shook his head slightly, not in disagreement exactly, but in the way of a man who does not want credit for the particular form his decency took. He looked at the kitchen garden. He looked at the house. He looked at the ridge visible over the roof line to the west, the bluff face catching the afternoon sun. "I'd like to keep working," he said. "If there's work to be had." "There's more work than I can manage alone," Clara said. "The operation needs to expand. I have orders I can't currently fill. I want 30 hives by spring and 50 within 2 years. Joe nodded. That's manageable. I'll pay you, Clara said. Full wages, back wages for the month Nadine took. He looked at her steadily. You don't have to do that. I know I don't have to, she said. He put his hat on his head. Then I'll start on the barn roof tomorrow. Douglas Alderman came to Carthage 3 weeks after the deed transfer. He had heard about the sale, had apparently contacted Nadine, and received confirmation and had come to see whether there was any avenue to the limestone he had been planning to buy. Clara received him at the farm in the parlor with 2 cups of coffee and the particular courtesy of a woman who has already won and can afford to be gracious. He was a businessman, as she had told Nadine, and he conducted himself as one. He made 3 distinct attempts to purchase the property, each at a higher price, each framed in different terms. He was not unpleasant about it. He was simply persistent in the way of men who have found that persistence usually works. Clara declined all 3 offers in the same even tone she had used with Nadine on the porch. At the end of the meeting, Alderman looked at the window facing the ridge and said with the candor of a man who has reached the end of his negotiating options, "That honey is the best thing I've eaten in 10 years. I know," Clara said. "My husband made it for 30 years before me." Alderman left without the ridge. He found another limestone deposit 14 miles north and built his quarry operation there and prospered adequately. He continued ordering Beaumont Ridge Cave honey through his St. Louis restaurants for the rest of his life, which Clara considered a satisfying resolution. Nadine Beaumont took the $800 to Kansas City. Clara heard secondhand through the kind of information that travels through small communities without anyone intending it to that she had married a merchant the following year. She did not hear what happened after that and did not inquire. The farm came back to life the way neglected things come back when they have been properly tended for long enough, gradually and then suddenly. The kitchen garden first, then the hay fields, then the barn, then the outbuildings in order of structural priority. Joe directed the physical rehabilitation with the methodical competence of a man who had spent 50 years making things work. Clara ran the honey operation and the business side of it and began writing letters to hotels and restaurants and specialty grocers that she had not previously had the production capacity to supply. By the spring of 1894, she had 30 hives in the expanded cave system, 2 chambers connected by a passage she had chipped herself, the walls whitewashed to reflect her lantern light, proper wooden shelving, a temperature that remained constant at 54 degrees through every season. The hum of it when she stood in the middle of the space was extraordinary, layered and complex and alive in the way that genuine abundance is alive, not the absence of problems, but the presence of so much working correctly that the problems lose their proportion. The Beaumont Ridge Cave Honey Company, as the Springfield newspaper called it, in a piece that ran in the autumn of 1894 and was reprinted in 2 St. Louis papers, was by any measure a success. But the word that Clara used in her own notebook in her own careful handwriting was not success. The word she used was continuation, because that was what it was. It was the continuation of something her husband's grandfather had started with an axe and a mule team, and her husband's father had continued with different tools, and her husband had continued with the same patience, in the same September mornings, in the same careful taking and leaving, and now she was continuing it with 20 hives and a supply contract and a bank relationship and the permanent satisfaction of a woman who has been told what she could not do and has done it anyway. The wild colony against the back wall of the original chamber had never been touched. Clara had kept the same practice. Her husband kept visiting it in September, taking nothing, making sure the entrance was clear, leaving it as she found it. The colony had no awareness of the human drama that had surrounded it for 3 years, had no knowledge that its home had nearly been blasted apart for road gravel, had no opinion about the legal proceedings and the bank negotiations and the confrontation on the porch with the 20 silver dollars. It simply continued, as it had continued for decades before Clara Beaumont came to the ridge with a candle and a notebook, and as it would continue long after any individual human story reached its conclusion. The Springfield Historical Society sent a representative in 1897 to document what they were calling the most productive specialty honey operation in the state of Missouri. He was a young man with a notebook, which Clara found amusing, and he wanted to know how she had built it and why she had not given up, and whether she had any advice for other women attempting to establish independent businesses. Clara thought about this for a moment, standing at the entrance to the cave chamber with the sound of 30 hives behind her. She said, learn what you're working with before you try to use it. Leave more than you take. Do not mistake patience for weakness in yourself or in anything else. And if someone counts out 20 silver dollars on a porch rail and tells you that's all you're worth, find the nearest limestone bluff and start climbing. The young man wrote it all down. Joe worked the Beaumont farm for 11 more years. He died in the spring of 1904 at the age of 84 in the small cottage Clara had built for him at the edge of the north pasture, in a bed with clean sheets and a window that looked out toward the ridge. She buried him on the hill behind the house next to her husband, and she had the headstone carved with an inscription that said what was true and sufficient. He showed me where to start. The operation she had built from 12 jars and 20 silver dollars grew to 50 hives, then held there because Clara had learned from the bees themselves that the optimal scale of any operation was the scale at which quality could be maintained completely, and she was not interested in growth for its own sake. She was interested in the honey. She was interested in making the thing that had been made in that ridge for longer than any Beaumont had owned any acre of it, made with the same care and the same restraint and the same understanding that you took what was offered and left what was needed. She was 67 when she paid off the bank loan entirely and burned the document in the kitchen stove. She was 71 when she sat on the porch of the house she had been born in and watched her granddaughter carry the first jar of that season's harvest down the slope from the ridge, in the same kind of mason jar Clara had used in 1892, and felt the kind of satisfaction that has no name in most languages, but is recognizable to anyone who has spent decades building something that outlasts the worst thing that ever happened to them. She kept a notebook for 60 years, every harvest, every colony count, every sale, every problem, and its solution recorded in the same small, precise handwriting on page after page of a record that was also without intending to be a history of what a person can build when they have nothing except time and a crack in a limestone bluff and a reason to keep climbing. The wild colony is still there. The limestone face of Beaumont Ridge still holds the entrance crack. Unchanged, the bees still moving in and out of the rock on routes so established they seem structural, part of the ridge itself. The conservation easement that protects the ridge from quarrying was established in 1967 by Clara's granddaughter, who had grown up with the story the way some children grow up with fairy tales, except that this story came with documentation, with a notebook and a sales ledger, and the headstone on the hill that said, "He showed me where to start." The cave chambers still exist. The marks of Clara's chisel are still visible on the limestone walls of the second alcove, the passage she cut by hand, inch by inch, in the winter of 1892, when she needed more room and had no tool for it except a hammer and a cold chisel, and the particular stubbornness of a woman who has already slept 3 winters on a stone floor and finds the concept of impossible somewhat unconvincing. On quiet days, standing at the entrance to the first chamber, you can still hear it. The hum of the wild colony deep in the limestone, unchanged, unhurried. The sound of 10,000 living things doing the work they were made for in a darkness that has sheltered them for longer than any human story attached to this ridge can fully account for. Clara Beaumont lost everything at 64 years old and built it back from a crack in a rock and a notebook and 20 silver dollars and the knowledge left to her by a man who loved her in the particular language of careful tending of where the honey was. Some people call that a story about resilience or about justice or about the stubbornness of women who have been underestimated. Clara would have called it something simpler. She would have called it continuation. The bees would not have called it anything at all. They would have simply kept working as they had always kept working in the cool dark of the limestone, making something sweet out of what the world offered, leaving enough behind to survive whatever came next. As they do still, as they will.